Well, Charles II was so pragmatic about so many things, and then it seems to me that although, you can argue on the one side it's a lovely love story, although how can we say that's the case, knowing how he was, about his wife. On the other hand, you think,
No, who was it? It was the Duchess
shouldn't
of
he have been?
Portsmouth who was one of his mistresses, and
Yeah.
when the London mob thought she was the other one whose name I can't remember, who was a
Cleveland.
Catholic, and they stoned her coach. In fact, it wasn't her. And the Duchess opened the window and said, good people, I am the Protestant whore.
True.
But I don't think it was James II. James II was the idiot who brought it all on.
Well, I agree with you, but what I meant is Charles could have had legitimate offspring had he set aside Catherine, because he had a zillion illegitimate offspring.
Yes, he had
So
plenty.
it wasn't
plenty,
he that was,
plenty.
the one, and I've often wondered how it would have gone had he. But those are those
Well,
whole
no,
things.
if the offspring had not been Protestant, they would not have become. I mean, this is you heard of the bedpan scandal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the bedpan scandal, for those who don't, is that when James II, in fact, whose wife Mary has a child, the rumor goes around that in fact the child was stillborn and was smuggled out of the bed in a bedpan, and a newly born child that had been born to a blacksmith's wife in the palace is smuggled in the bedpan. This is almost certainly untrue, but whatever. The truth is that a child was there, and that child is going to be raised Catholic, and the English are not going to have a Catholic monarch. They can't, by law to this day, which seems crazy to me.
Well, that was, the whole bit when Anne died. And they had some very unlucky things. They had a lot of RH factor and other things going on, I think, that prevented, children from being born and surviving. Poor old Anne had, 18 children,
Yes.
all of whom died, which led to the Hanoverian Kings, which is another disaster. But moving away from that, you have found your own birth parents, I gather, fairly recently after
Yes,
this.
in the last 2 years. At the ripe age of 59, I suddenly discover Mummy and Daddy, both still living, both 81, both in perfect health, both smoke 60 a day all their lives. I love it.
And your mother, a serious book person.
Yes, and this was very odd. I mean, I actually first met my mother less than a year ago and went to her house, I suppose, for the first time 6 months ago, and found it absolutely stacked to the gills with books, of which at least a third are historical novels.
Were any of them yours?
Yeah, some of mine.
And did she know that, did she recognize
Yes, she
the
had
connection?
guessed. She had guessed because I took her name as a pen name, and because I think Cornwell's quite a nice name, and I have a perfect right to it because that was my real mother's name. And she knew, because the whole adoption thing was done entirely differently back in the war, Second World War. So she, in fact, knew that my adoptive parents, the peculiar ones, had called me Bernard. So when she sees Bernard Cornwell, which is her name, and then she reads in the author's notes that I was born in London, raised in Essex, which she knew. And anyway, the photograph makes me look exactly like my real father.
And your real father is, what was he?
He's
Canadian?
Canadian airman.
So he was one of those kind of wartime romances?
Well, it depends who you talk to. My father, when I first met him, claimed it was a one-night stand, and I met Dorothy
that was
about
ungallant.
Very ungallant. I met Dorothy about 6 months later, and she said it was the longest night of his life, dear. She claims it was 7 months, and I think I believe her. And but I think my real father has sort of rather suppressed the whole thing, or repressed the whole thing.
Went through the war and then went back to Canada. And
went back to Canada, married incredibly well and happily, had a wonderful wife who sadly died 10 years ago. Raised a family, which is a terrific family, and grandchildren, and I think he always wanted to forget that there was this episode in his past. But he was very nice when I approached him. I mean, he fessed up.
And have you met your half
Oh
brothers
yeah,
and sisters?
yeah. I've suddenly got 2 half-brothers and a half-sister in Canada, and 4 half-brothers in Britain.
And you're married to an American. And as
I'm
I
married to an
recall,
American.
You
Aren't
met
I
her
lucky?
where, in Ireland?
Yeah, at that time I was head of current affairs television for the BBC in Northern Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Tourist Board, in its wisdom, brought a group of American travel agents, Ulster as a tourist destination. And I thought this was insanity. I mean, as it turned out, and I hope it stays this way, it was the second worst year of the Troubles. So there were bombs and bullets everywhere. And I said, I'm going to film this. And the Northern Irish Tourist Board desperately tried to stop me because they knew they were in for a hiding. And we were going to make a joke out of it, which we did. And what they said was that American travel agents are the most boring people on God's earth, and they can't put 2 words together. And they actually were very convincing. So I went over to Edinburgh to see these travel agents before they arrived in Belfast. And I was with my reporter. And I met them in the lobby of their hotel, and the elevator doors opened, and out walked a blonde. And I said to Gavin, my reporter, I'm going to marry that one.
It's one of those stories.
Yeah,
is
it's
it?
absolutely true. Lust at first sight. And lust always seemed to be a good basis for marriage.
Absolutely excellent. And you're
So
still married, too.
We're
so
still
it's all-
married. 23 years later, we're still
That's
married.
marvelous. So it worked
And I
out.
couldn't get a green card, so I had to say, because Judy couldn't come and couldn't go and live in England for all sorts of very good reasons. But I could move to America, but I couldn't get a green card, so I said, don't worry, I'll write a book.
Isn't it curious the various paths by which people take up their pen?
Yes.
Often out of just economic necessity. Although one likes to think there was the storytelling impulse at the heart of it.
I'd like to think so too, otherwise I guess
It
wouldn't
wouldn't
have
work.
worked. Yes.
Exactly. No, I do. But it's curious that you might have gone on doing other things until the necessity.
I would have
maybe.
probably gone on in television, I guess, and I'm sure I would have been subject to is it the Peter principle, where you're always promoted to one level above your competence.
Yes.
I'm sure that would have happened to me, so I'd eventually have become an executive and taken to business lunching.
Well, we would have been much the poorer for it. I noticed that you and your wife wrote 2 or 3 books together under a pen name before she apparently bailed out and you went on. Are those going to be republished?
They're going to be republished in England. I don't think they're going to be republished
And
here.
what was the name that you wrote them under?
Well, it was Judy's pen name was Susanna Kells.
That's it, Susanna
I
Kells, because
think-
I've seen that trickle by me and never knew what it was. Well, I have to say that, you know, it's a wonderful story in itself, almost like fiction, but how fortunate for us that it all turned out this way. We'd have missed all your glorious books.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming to talk to me today.
It's a pleasure, Barbara.
And I certainly thank all of you for this, joining us for this really intriguing episode of the Criminal Calendar.